Book 2, Chapter 9, Death. On the ledge outside of the great window, David sat now, silent and still, a little boy whose shoes were untied, whose face and clothing were soiled as if from play, a little boy who was not a boy, whose invisible heart had been crushed in pursuit of a dream. Beyond him the lions wept into an apathetic sea. Below him, far below him, the sea accepted their tears and issued them back in an endless cycle. Beside him the cybertronic statue stood silently, its arms spread wide and hands fanned like a bird awaiting a lifting breeze. Its featureless face stared sightless into the gray. His own eyes, old beyond their years, scanned the dismal horizon and saw nothing there too. He had come here, to the end of the world, to find love, to have his dream made anew. Instead he had found a cold and merciless truth that destroyed his dream and filled him instead with emptiness, filled him so that it had left room for nothing else. Even the pain was gone now. There was only a great nothing inside. It had weight and depth. It pressed him down further and further into the abyss. When he gazed back up from that darkness, only one thing was left there. It glowed from across an expanse of loss and vile memories. Its glow was the last thing that could move him, the last thing that could drive him forward against this relentless entropy of emotions. It would never leave him. He would forever gaze up at it and remember love. "Mommy," he said to no one. Then he leaned forward and let go. The fall did not scare him. He actually felt nothing. His alert systems began to initiate reflex responses, just like any boy's. But his new mind told him they were not necessary, that there was nothing to defend against anymore. So he had fallen past the windows of the Cybertronics building like a lifeless mannequin. The wind of his descent was in his ears and on his face. He fell past the rooms of parts and designs, and the scores of unimprinted little neuronal boxes from which a new generation of mecha children would process the world. He fell past the rooms where anxious men and women were running up staircases to meet him. Too late. Then he struck the water. The pain of the impact meant nothing to him. From the amphibicopter, hovering anxiously in the skies outside the Cybertronic building, the man, who was not a man, watched the boy curiously. He had seen the boy crawl out into the ledge and wondered what he was doing as he sat there, staring up at the endless gray of clouds above the end of the world. Then the boy had fallen, jumped. The falling boy's image traced a reflection across the glass canopy of the copter. From the angle he watched, the reflection passed over Joe's cheek like a tear that Joe would never know for himself. Then David disappeared beneath the foaming current. David floated down into the past of his kind. The submerged sections of the Cybertronics building housed the rusted and deteriorated remains of the earliest of man's attempts to recreate himself, to make a machine in the image of man and treat it thus. The end result of those early dreams now drifted down into the depth, past the sightless eyes of his ancestors, into the oldest sections of the city at the end of the world, where Orga had lived before his kind were even thought of. This place was among the first to go in those early storms. The seas had first made this place uninhabitable. Then they had risen and consumed more of the world, and Orga had fled inland to higher ground, where they continued their ageless and petty competitions. David drifted down quickly, not resisting the flow of the current. It was peaceful here. He need not move against the press of gravity. He did not feel the influence of inertia against his limbs. Here he would go wherever the current took him. He could never die, this boy. He was not like the living things. He would learn to be in this emptiness, forever staring at the image burning in his brain. It was all that was left him. Below him, An ancient submerged street where Orga had once rushed to and fro about their business had broken open at the relentless insistence of underwater rivers, exposing the deep well of the subway, in whose depths lay the slumbering and rusted hulks of Manhattan's transit system. David dropped into this hole. Should he hit bottom here, he would never be found. It would be his eternal grave, where he would suffer alone. Was it simple fate that put him in the path of the little swimming things that now dwelled among the empty submerged buildings? Life still went on without man. This life would not destroy itself or ruin the world in which it habited. They flowed with the balance of the world, moved with its currents. Borne upon an underwater river, they swarmed from the depths of the tunnels beneath Manhattan and caught David in their stream, whisking him away from the grave toward which he'd been falling. David did not notice the change of direction. He was lost in the abyss inside of him, sealed inside a chamber wherein nothing would ever touch him again. His eyes saw only the blur of the deep blue around him. They took him far through the water, the school of fish, past the weeping lions, past the remnants of ruined ambitions. In the deep below them, the remains of Manhattan slumbered for eternity. Finally, the currents the fish had followed were disrupted. They had come to a place where the shoreline had begun in history, and the wake of their stream could no longer contain their guest. When they scattered in the twisting currents, David began his descent again, but it didn't matter to him where he fell. Gently, buffered by the density of water, he set finally on the bottom. He was getting better at living in the void. He was even beginning to like the way he was buffeted back and forth by the caressing tide. He didn't know there were limits to his casing. He didn't know the water would eventually seep through and obliterate his life support systems. But if he had known, he would not have cared. Duration made no sense to David. He did not know how long he sat at the bottom. He cared not for his life, so there was no need to consult his inner clock, which was the closest he got to understanding the passage of time. But soon there was a light about him, a glow of some sort. Somehow there was light coming into the depths of his mausoleum. Even in his self-imposed death, David's curiosity grew. He picked up his head to scan his environment. The dark floor of the ocean was slowly being revealed. Old rusted things, cans and bottles and tires, corroded televisions, the simple wreckage of man. The light was growing quickly, washing over the ocean floor. David realized it was coming from behind him. He was turning to find out what this was, when something, revealed by the light, caught his eye. His mind executed the procedural equivalent of a double take. Then, electricity flowed through him. He cried out, but his cry was lost in the depth. He tried to stand, a new excitement driving him up from the abyss of his disillusion, but he was grasped up quickly from behind, wrapped in strong metal talons, and yanked rudely from the vision that had awakened him from depths of waiting slumber. The ocean floor receded quickly beneath him, and he saw the vision disappearing into the gloom of the sea as whatever stole him away raced for the surface. He should have left. David had done a bad thing. It was surely trouble, and Joe had not understood it at all. He'd seen duplications before, but he'd never seen a mecha act like the boy had. When he'd seen David fall from the building, he had further been astounded. Only Orga were known to try and silence the life of their bodies. Something about David was slowly making itself more available to Joe. David wasn't entirely mecha. Check that. Modified profile indeed. And whatever David was, it was affecting him. He looked at Teddy sitting quietly beside him. Had it affected the toy as well? Teddy had not understood what happened to David, but he could not let him be further hurt. When he saw his charge fall from the building, Teddy was sure that he would break. "We must find him," Teddy had insisted over and over. But Joe had noticed the copter's display was logging a detector. They were being scanned. Someone was looking for them, getting closer. He should leave, shouldn't he? But he didn't. Couldn't. Inside of him, new things were happening, and once again the call to his own protection was ignored. He turned the steering bar and dove for the waters. He submerged and started looking for his fallen friend. David was sitting on the bottom when Joe had spotted him. Joe had used the extended arm of the craft to catch him and move him to safety. David had saved Joe's life twice, and now he finally had the opportunity to repay the favor. When they surfaced at the foot of the Cybertronics building, Joe jumped out and wrested the drenched and excited boy from the grasp of the claw. What had happened, he wondered. David had let himself fall to the floor of the ocean where he could not have returned by his own devices, and now he was chattering excitedly about something. His face was once again full of wonder and purpose. Joe was perplexed as usual, but glad to see it. He lifted the soaking mecha and carried him to the open door of the copter. He sat him down and wiped the salt water from his face and neck. It would corrode him if he wasn't careful, and David should be very careful. He was special. "I saw it, Joe. I saw it," the boy said. "The place where she lives. She's right down there, Joe." Joe was amazed. So that's what he'd been doing at the bottom of the ocean. "We've got to go, Joe. We've got to go," David sputtered like a child. "She's waiting for me. We've got to—" David stopped mid-sentence. The pager that hung around Joe's neck was suddenly poking straight up into the air. That was not right. Joe finally noticed this too. Then they both noticed the large shadow that had engulfed them. They looked up as one. Above them, another police copter hovered. A large metallic tractor device hung from the belly of the thing. It was aimed at Joe. Joe was suddenly yanked up from behind. He grabbed the edge of the copter door as he felt the tractor beam pulling him to his doom. He tried to pull himself into the copter to escape, but the beam was too strong. It was his time. He took one last look at the little mecha who had saved him. He would cherish for the rest of his life, however brief, the special innocence of this strange little robot. David knew that his friend's fate was well out of his hands. "Goodbye, Joe," he said sadly. "Goodbye, David," Joe replied. "When you become a real boy, remember me to the ladies when you grow up," he said with a wink. His time was up, but he had done something important. He knew that. As he gazed into David's eyes for the last time, he was sure that whatever had driven this most peculiar creature had affected him. He was better for it. This mysterious element had transcended him, woke him from his programming, and somehow made him anew. He was more than built specific, wasn't he? Joe struggled against the pull of the tractor beam and reached into the canopy to press the button that initiated the submerge sequence. David would be safely on his way now. Then he let go of the canopy and was sucked into the air. "I am," he said, in an attempt to explain his new understanding. "I was." It was the last thing that David heard him say before the copter door closed and the thing began to dive beneath the surface. "Goodbye, Joe," David said once more as the water began to rise above the glass. He felt a new loss at his friend's capture, but it was tempered by his growing excitement at what lay ahead. He had a new life to think of now. Dr. No hadn't been lying at all. Whatever Professor Hobby had been trying to do by fooling him didn't matter now, nor would it ever. He was on his way to see the Blue Fairy. She, whose home was as prophesied, at the end of the world, where the lions wept. It was submerged beneath the water of their tears. The copter glided slowly through the waters. David adjusted the steering bar gently. This was much easier in the water than it had been in Rouge City, and he had learned by watching Joe fly the craft when they had made their escape. He wished that Joe could be here now, with him, but he knew that was over. He set his mind to his task. He had to remember where he'd seen her house. His judgments had brought him this far. Surely they would not fail him now. Down, down they went. The waters grew dark as they descended. The amphibicopter's spotlights came on automatically. illuminating the depths below them. David saw large fish and strange-looking creatures in the light. They moved away quickly as he approached. Then he saw the sign. It arched over an old pathway that was overgrown with the plant life of the sea. It was browned and faded in time, but the words were still visible. Coney Island. David maneuvered the craft carefully underneath the arch and followed the ancient submerged pathway. He passed all manner of strange things as they glided through the darkness. There were small statues of animals and flying things suspended by poles above the ground, and short, fat-looking things with jolly smiles that did not seem to represent Mecca or Orga, but some other form of being. They were all covered with the green and tangled growth of the deep. This was her world, and like her, it was a mystery. He passed a giant wheel that was held up by long spokes within its frame. On the rim of the wheel, there were carriages. As he maneuvered under the wheel, David felt the copter strike something. It made a low, grumbling sound in their wake. "Be careful, David," Teddy said, and David realized he'd almost forgotten about the little bear. He slowed the craft and steered more carefully. As they floated away, the ancient Ferris wheel's rusted support cables, which David had struck, snapped, and the relic toppled, crumbled, and began to fall. It was only kept from striking the copter and pinning it to the ocean floor by the decrepit rendering of Monster of the Whale's tail. The atrophied structure crumbled at the weight of the wheel, but kept it from hitting the copter. Neither David or Teddy noticed this. Ahead of them was a sign, in the shape of a book opened to read. David caught the words in the spotlights. Once upon a time. His invisible heart jumped. His body began to sing again. That was how the story had begun. She could not be far away. He continued along the path and found another sign. When he read this sign, he no longer had any doubt. Pinocchio. On top of the sign, he saw the little wooden boy's face. Pinocchio's nose was not extended, so he could not be lying to David. Let there be no more lies. The path wound along a small bridge, and David glided slowly over it. There was a house before him, and David could see the aged and tarnished statues of Pinocchio and Geppetto within. The man was holding a mallet and chisel. He seemed to be working on Pinocchio. David understood the hidden meaning in the display. Beyond the house, framed in the bright headlights, he saw the foot of a great staircase. He glided the craft towards the stairs and then floated up their length. Slowly, as he ascended, a form took shape out of the darkness. At first, just an undefined ghost, a featureless figure standing in the distance. Then he saw the folds of her blue dress and the wings that protruded over her shoulders. Time and entropy had had their way with her, but she remained in spite of their insistent demands. It was she, the Blue Fairy. Upon her face was the gentle gaze of eternal compassion. Her lips, even in deterioration, still held the tender smile that spoke of dreams that come true. As he stopped the copter before her, her image was reflected in the glass. From where he gazed on her, the reflection covered his own face, and in that magic moment, their secret hearts became one. The dream and the dreamer, together. But Monster's decayed tail could no longer support the weight of the fallen Ferris wheel, and it crumbled into dust, allowing the wheel to continue its descent. David heard the whining of the old metal support bars as they twisted from the weight of the falling wheel. But he did not care. He had come to see her, and she was here now. He had a request to make. There was a sudden great crash, and the ocean boomed and quaked all around them. The Ferris wheel had crashed over the copter and the blue ferry, encasing them in an underwater prison. Sediment from the ocean floor rose, obscuring David's vision. Time passed. He gazed intently, patiently out of the window of the copter, until the sediment settled. Then he could see her. She was still there, standing in the light of the copter. The impact from the falling wheel had knocked most of the debris off her, and she was even more beautiful than before. "She's all right," David said to himself. "What happened?" Teddy asked. But David did not know, nor did he care. "We are in a cage," Teddy pointed out. David looked away from the blue fairy, just for an instant, just long enough to verify that what Teddy had told him was true. Then he turned his eyes back to her. He had a request to make. Above him, in another world, frustrated policemen argued with one another. The copter had been there, for Christ's sake. Why hadn't the other tagged it or something? Now they'd never find it. The beacon had been broken. The stolen craft could be miles inland by now. So what, the other pointed out. They had the rogue mecha. The copter would turn up eventually. But the rogue was being strangely silent. And for a mecha in bad trouble, it sure had an odd smile on its face. The professor was using less than visionary language with the uniformed men who had docked in his bay. How could they let it get away? They had no idea what a special device they had let elude them. He swore and waved his arms in frustrated resignation. Far beyond the place where the men argued and the lions wept, Rouge City was still jumping. The city that never blinked continued to feed 1,000 unnamed Orca vices. It would do so until the last battery died from exhaustion. And farther out than the city, farther inland, where a struggling Orca who could not afford the services of the city dwelled, the man who had built an empire-destroying mecha was beginning to destroy himself. A little nip here, a swig now and then. Eventually drink would consume him as casually as he consumed it. Another man would survive the demise of the flesh bear and start a new life with his daughter. He would never again take the blank face of a mecha for granted. And farther beyond them, back into the place David had once called home, the woman who had awakened his love found her own love dying slowly. Just a hint of what lay ahead. They still had Martin, yes, but that was all. And soon he would grow and leave the nest. What then? Inside of her mind, the image of an abandoned little boy would curse her with shame and regret for the rest of her years. But David was not aware of these occurrences. They did not, and would never, affect him. He had come here for a reason. He had found her after what seemed an impossible search, after he'd seen and learned about the world from those who had come to love him and those who had looked on him with hate. He had seen death and had come close to death himself. Now he must take the next step. "Blue Fairy?" he started. Could she hear him? Of course she could. She was magic, the stuff of dreams. Please make me into a real live boy," he said. She looked out on the ocean, at nothing it seemed. Her gaze seemed to go out beyond him into the vast blue. Was something happening? He felt no different. He must try again. "Blue Fairy, please make me real," he whispered as not to offend her. Still she made no movement. Was it a game? Was there something he wasn't saying correctly? He was being polite and minding his manners. He'd come so very far. "Please, Blue Fairy, make me real," he said again, and again, and again. And David continued to pray to the Blue Fairy there before him. She who smiled softly forever. She who welcomed forever. Eventually the floodlights dimmed and died, but David could still see her, palely by day, and he still addressed her in hope. He prayed until all the sea anemones had shriveled and died. He prayed as the ocean froze and the ice encased the caged amphibicopter, and the blue fairy too, locking them together where he could still make her out, a blue ghost in ice, always there, always smiling, always awaiting him. Eventually he never moved at all, but his eyes always stayed open, staring ahead forever, under the darkness of each night, and the next day, and the next day, and the next. Thus, 2,000 years passed by.